There is an ideal method of progressive overload to maximize muscle growth. Many believe progressive overload is about making training harder than the last time. I actually think this is a bit misleading, and will describe why a bit later. However, two common ways of progressive overload involve increasing the weight lifted or increasing the number of repetitions performed. There was a new study comparing them. Let's dissect that paper and fit it into the overall scientific research. We will also discuss other potential training strategies you can use to elevate your physique and whether increasing sets or training frequency should be considered as progressive. This new study recruited 39 previously untrained individuals. For those disappointed they were untrained, don't worry, we'll mention data and trained individuals shortly. Subjects trained 4 sets on a unilateral leg extension 2 to 3 times per week for 10 weeks. With one-legged subjects, loads were adjusted to continuously reach failure in the range of 9 to 12 repetitions for each set. Thus, this leg was progressively overloaded by increasing the load with its other leg. They also performed repetitions to failure on each set, but stayed with the same load as the first session. So, they simply progressively overloaded by increasing repetitions. They progressed from an average of 9 repetitions per set to 15 repetitions per set. The final note is that the number of dominant legs was evenly split between conditions, and subjects alternated which leg was trained first in each session. The fact that subjects trained each leg with one of the conditions is great, as it means the same subjects were in both conditions, so differences in nutrition, genetics, and external lifestyle are less likely to confound the study. Strength gains and leg extension were underestimated. Results plus information. Lateral growth indicated by increased muscle hypertrophy was also similar between both conditions, suggesting that progressively overloading by increasing repetitions was as effective for muscle growth as increasing the load. The subjects were previously untrained, but we have this 2022 study previously seen at HYPY's house, which was conducted in 38 trained individuals. Subjects performed these lower levels of body exercises using these variables. One loading group tried to increase the load between sessions while staying in the 8 to 12 repetitions per repetition range. The other group kept the same load as the first session and intended only to perform more repetitions during the growth sessions of these muscle regions. The quadriceps and the cavale were measured and overall growth was similar between the two groups. Therefore, the data indicate that increasing the load or repetitions may be similar for muscle building in both untrained and trained individuals. I would say there are some underestimated reasonings behind this, and this reasoning also relates to the various training strategies available to you to maximize muscle growth. It also relates to whether we should consider increasing sets or training frequency as progressive. Overload reaching a high level of muscle fiber recruitment and tension are key to stimulating muscle hypertrophy. How is this achieved? Simply by taking your repetitions to or very close to failure. Stopping a few repetitions before failure may be good in many cases, as seen in our last video on training close to failure. Let's stimulate adaptations. These adaptations mean we can do more than we could before. We can lift a heavier load for the same number of repetitions, or we can perform more repetitions with the same load. In both cases, we are effectively keeping ourselves close to failure and, by extension, maintaining high muscle fiber recruitment and tension. So, in essence, increasing the load or repetitions. Fundamentally, it achieves the same thing by thinking of progressive overload as a cycle that works well. A hard training session stimulates adaptations. These adaptations allow us to increase the load or repetitions, and doing so keeps a training session considering that. Progressive overload isn't really about training more than last time. Instead, progressive overload keeps us training as hard as usual to continually stimulate growth. Additionally, progressive overload isn't a result of you digging for progressively deeper effort. Instead, progressive overload is proof that gains are happening now. There's an important detail we shouldn't overlook currently. The literature suggests repetitions between 6 to 35, as long as they are performed to or close to failure, produce similar muscles. Low hypertrophy repetitions, 6 probably involve too little time under high tension, while repetitions above 35 likely involve excessive fatigue that impairs muscle fiber recruitment and tension. With that in mind, there's a limit to how much you can increase repetitions. If you somehow reach the point of performing more than 35 repetitions, increasing the load is recommended and, generally, a combination of both load and repetitions increases in the long term is what will happen in most cases. For example, exercises involving smaller amounts of muscle mass are harder to progress in overload, and constantly increasing load in your training sessions on these is far from always possible unless you have access to very light microplates. But, as many don't add a rep here or there on these exercises, it's much more typical with less frequent load increases. The same logic applies to you becoming more trained, as the magnitude of adaptations decreases with more training experience. So adding a rep here or there may be much more common than increasing the number of reps. Part 2. Different paths, same gains? This part is not related to progressive overload over training sessions. Instead, it's about the multiple different training strategies you could use in one training session. It mentioned that, on average, similar muscles to hypertrophy can be observed between 6 and 35 ranges of repetitions, as long as it remains within this. It opens up many different training paths. The most common is to keep the same load between sets and train to failure in a given repetition range, but an alternative as explored in this paper is to decrease the load. All subjects train to voluntary failure with these variables in the first set of each exercise. All individuals used a maximum load of 10 repetitions, which is a load that can be lifted for a maximum of 10 repetitions. One group kept the same load in the remaining sets. A second group actually decreased the load by 5% in the last 2 sets of each exercise. And the third group decreased the load by 10% in the last 2 sets. As subjects were trained to failure, they naturally added repetitions over time. But, on top of this, the maximum strength of 10 repetitions was tested again every 2 weeks to update the training loads. All groups ended up seeing similar biceps hypertrophy. Interestingly, the group that decreased the load by 10%, despite also training to failure and seeing similar growth, subjectively assessed their training sessions as being a bit easier. For you, you can also increase the load between sets, resulting in fewer repetitions. In fact, this study compared doing exactly that with another group that trained a bit more normally. Muscle growth was similar between both. So, the key here is there are many different paths to muscle hypertrophy. As we define progressive overload, it continues to train hard to keep stimulating adaptations. Increasing sets or training frequency don't necessarily do that. For example, let's say you run this workout on the next workout and all you do is just add a set and nothing more. The problem with this is assuming that enough adaptations were stimulated from the first session. From those previous ones, sets were easier and hence less effective. The extra set you add predominantly just increases the total work you're doing. It doesn't keep training hard on the other sets. The same applies to increasing training frequency. Let's say you perform this same workout and, if all you do is add another training session in a week, assuming enough adaptations were stimulated from the first session, all those sets are going to be easier. So this extra session is just much more overall work on top of that. There's a limit to how much you can add sets or training sessions before facing recovery issues, neither of which mean you should never increase sets or training frequency. In fact, back in October last year, we dissected that this article finds adding sets in weeks to extremely high numbers led to greater muscle growth than performing the same number of sets every week. Although all groups progressively overloaded by increasing load in their sets, and there were crucial details, meaning this study isn't proof you have to add sets over weeks, but as described in the previous video, someone could experiment this training style if it suits everyone. Although it's absolutely fine and much more common to perform the same number of sets and use the same training frequency every week, with perhaps some changes over many months or years. If you're looking for more guidance on programming to get your desired physique, it can be complicated and time-consuming. As much as it's our high-quality partner, the Alpha Progression app can help you generate a spatial training program that's 100% tailored to your needs in under 3 minutes. Just specify the equipment you have, how often and for how long you want to train, and whether you want to focus on or neglect certain muscles. There are even advanced options to periodize your training and implement loads. There are over a quadrillion input combinations on which your plan is based, and with the touch of a few buttons, you can further customize things through analyzing your previous performance. The app provides progressive overload recommendations during your workouts to help you keep gaining. The app automatically generates charts displaying your long-term progression, thus saving your time from having to manually track your progression. In the link in the comments and description gives you have 2 free trials of all premium features, and if you like and decide to go beyond the link, gives you 20% off a subscription. I truly believe the app is awesome and the reviews speak for it. Part 4. What about strength gains? In this recall on the newest paper's resistance, gains were similar between increasing load and reps I haven't mentioned yet in the 2022 article on trained individuals. Squat strength gains were similar between increasing load and repetitions. However, two technical considerations I've decided to detail in the pinned comment to tell over time. Tell us why these findings are probably a bit misleading. My current thinking is that strength is generally considered as the maximum load you can lift. Increasing load is likely to be better. Furthermore, largely training with heavy loads for fewer than 6 repetitions are great for increasing strength. Illustrating this, these researchers had trained individuals train these exercises. One group with loads adjusted to keep training to failure in the 2 to 4 repetition range, while a second group loads adjusted to keep training failure in the 8 to 12 repetition range. Strength gains in the press and back squat favored training with 2 to 4 repetitions, as they did in this study to keep training hard in lower repetition ranges by increasing load in training sessions. Part 5. Summary. As we define it, progressive overload can be thought of as an intense training cycle that produces adaptations. Adaptations allow us to increase the load or repetitions, and doing so keeps hard training. Progressively overloading through increasing load or repetitions has been shown to produce similar muscle growth in both untrained and trained individuals. However, there are a few reasons indicating that, in the long term, using a combination of both is probably more viable. Increasing sets or increasing training frequency predominantly increase the overall work you're doing. Although both approaches have their place, neither of them fits into our parameters of progressive overload to maximize strength gains. Increasing the load is likely the best strategy. If you like this content and want to see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and enable the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Thank you for watching.